Welcome to part two of the Burden of Credibility lecture. You've already listened to and studied part one, dealing with the Kennedy years, tracing John Kennedy's rise as a Cold War president from his election in 1960 to his tragic assassination in November of 1963. It was on November 22nd, that fateful day in Dallas, Texas, that Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson was sworn in as the new president of the United States. And in this famous photograph, you can see people crowded into the forward compartment of what was effectively the president's airplane, what we call Air Force One now. There's LBJ's wife, Lady Bird Johnson, standing to his right. There's, of course, the now widowed Jacqueline Kennedy, also standing now next to the new president as he takes the oath of office. A remarkable scene. Jackie's coat, it was a pink button-up coat that still bore the bloodstains of her husband, her now dead husband. The shock really etched into her face seemed to speak really for I think the entire mood of the country. This new man as president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was no foreigner to politics. He had spent a lifetime in elected office and had been long been ambitious for a chance at the presidency. He was defeated in the Democratic nominating convention of 1960 by John Kennedy and only reluctantly agreed to be his vice president. And when he became president upon Kennedy's death, I'm sure it was not as he had ever imagined it would be. And like John Kennedy, LBJ will now really cast a wide influence over his time as president. A man of larger-than-life personality and a real genuine character in American political history. We'll take a minute here to talk a bit about Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was a Texan by birth, born in Stonewall, Texas in 1908. As a young man out of college, he was a school teacher in Cotulla, Texas, the West Hill country of Texas, among the poorest, threadbare farming, hardscrabble farming regions in the country. Many of his students were the children of migrant farm workers who could only afford to attend school seasonally and for a short time. And it seems that this experience perhaps left an indelible mark on LBJ as he comes to be universally known. Left a indelible mark on him for the sympathy, the suffering of the poor and the working poor in particular, and we'll see how that traces through his political career. Well, he becomes a New Deal Democrat and a devotee of Franklin Roosevelt, switches his profession from school teaching to politics, and in 1937 wins a seat in the House of Representatives. LBJ was a tireless political worker and campaigner, a colorful figure who had the gift of gab and could tell a story, even not afraid, of course, to embellish on any particular story he might be telling. Among the many such stories were the one where he claimed his grandfather had died at the Alamo, the famous stand at the Alamo, beloved in Texans' memory. And it was a great story, except for the fact that it wasn't true. His grandfather was not at the Alamo. But he moved forward in his political career with ambition and skill and a cunning, really, for the profession. In 1949, he won a great surprise victory over beloved Texas incumbent politician to become the new United States Senator from Texas. And his career in the Senate will really take off. By 1954, Johnson will be named the Senate Majority Leader, really the second, maybe, or third most powerful person in Washington behind the president. And as Senate Majority Leader from 1954 to 1960, Johnson will carve out a legislative career like few others in American history. He was a master of the political deal and a tremendous wielder of political influence while Majority Leader of the Senate, which I suppose is why he thought he might be the leading candidate on the Democratic Party nomination in 1960 for the presidency. But the Kennedys outmaneuvered Johnson at the convention, and he was left only to be offered the vice presidency to balance the ticket with Kennedy as a Southerner, to balance the Northeastern liberal support that Kennedy figured to get. But now as president in 1963, this man with the Texas-sized personality, the colorful, persuasive, relentless personality, and you see the pictures here that demonstrate the ways that that Johnson liked to do business, using his physical size, his stature, to lean in, get into that personal space bubble of whoever he was talking to, breathe that hot Texas breath right into their grill. With enough of this, you were willing to promise him anything if he'd just leave you alone. He was one of these guys that needed only about 4 hours of sleep a night, and the rest of the time he was living and breathing and eating politics. He was famous for calling up constituents and calling up colleagues in all hours of the night, and to wrangle and to do a bit of arm twisting to get support on an upcoming bill, waking you up out of the dead of sleep, haranguing you until, again, just to get him off the phone, you would say, "Yes, Lyndon, I'll support you." But as president now, left to pick up the pieces, he had his own vision. Certainly, he made good on Kennedy's promise to support civil rights, and in fact, in 1964, it'll be Lyndon Johnson who signs the landmark Civil Rights Bill of 1964. Even though he was a Southern white Democrat, he had never taken a hard stance as a segregationist in his career. And in fact, the great sort of vision that he holds out for the nation during his presidency will be that which we remember as the Great Society. President Johnson envisioned a nation rich enough, an America rich enough to eliminate poverty. He had been impressed, of course, with what the New Deal had accomplished during the Great Depression, and now that America was out of depression and really reaping the great benefits of its post-World War II economy and economic takeoff, he argued that we were, as a nation, rich enough to essentially eliminate poverty. And declaring an unconditional war on poverty, LBJ announced his plans for a great society. Now, much has been written and said about the ultimate failure of the Great Society, but keep in mind that what Johnson was trying to accomplish was a kind of infrastructure of relief and assistance for those who, at the bottom of the economic ladder, he felt deserved every opportunity to experience that climb, that American dream of rags to if not riches, at least to a decent subsistence. And so, as an old school teacher, he supported programs to help underprivileged school-age kids, federally subsidized hot lunch programs, for example, meant to ensure that no child went to school on an empty stomach. The Head Start program was another Great Society project, the Head Start program, which exists still today, a program to rescue kids after school whose parent or parents either worked or were absent, to keep a child from returning to an empty home, to give them constructive, engaging time to attend after school projects. Even up to college age students, the creation of federally subsidized grants and loans, so that the chance to attend college would not be dictated by one's wealth or economic status. So these are the kinds of programs that Johnson was able to enact that one way or another have defined our culture over the last half century. But in many other ways, it's true. The Great Society program would fall far short, certainly, of its goal to end poverty in the country. And to understand why, in the most practical sense, is to understand the tragedy, ultimately, of Lyndon Johnson's presidency. Because the single greatest reason why ultimately the ambitions of a great society were defeated, one has to turn to the growing conflict in Southeast Asia, and once again, the burden of credibility. It will be Lyndon Johnson that ultimately escalates America's involvement in Vietnam most dramatically, almost exponentially. And after his presidency had ended and he was living in retirement in Texas, he gave an interview to Doris Kearns, the historian, in which he acknowledged the divided mind he had on the Vietnam War. He knew he had misgivings. He had been to Vietnam. He had met with the South Vietnamese regime that we supported. He had expressed his concerns that regime was not perhaps capable of doing the job of taking on the communists. And as he told years later, told the interviewer, he said, yet I knew that if we let communist aggression succeed in taking over South Vietnam, there would follow in this country an endless national debate that would shatter my presidency, kill my administration, and damage our democracy. In other words, Johnson was haunted by a fear that should he not act quickly enough or do enough to stem the communist tide in Vietnam, that somehow what was sometimes called the domino effect or domino theory would end up seeing a tide, a kind of tsunami of communism spread across Southeast Asia. And that he was not willing to risk as president. Johnson had a sense, I think, of his place in history, and he didn't want to be the president who would be remembered for somehow losing Asia to communism. And this was a powerful sort of haunting specter. It had been President Eisenhower who had articulated the domino theory. You knock over the first one, said Ike, and what will happen to the last is a certainty that it will go over very quickly. The remaining countries in Southeast Asia would be menaced by a great flanking movement. The loss of South Vietnam would have grave consequences for the United States and for freedom. So the problem of making America's power credible and to stand up to the promise of defending the free world, as Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy before him had done, to convince the American public that a war in Southeast Asia was now in the best interests of our nation. This was going to be a hard argument. Most Americans, frankly, by 1964 cared little, understood little about Vietnam. Public opinion polls revealed that, for example, most adult Americans were hard-pressed to even locate Vietnam on a world map. It seemed far away. It seemed almost trivially small to think that somehow America would now have to commit itself to that country. The problem for Johnson was somehow selling it, but Johnson was an expert salesman. As a politician, as a snake oil salesman style politician, Lyndon Johnson could, as they say, sell ice to the Eskimos. But it was more than just his personality, his persona, that would come into play now in August of 1964 in what's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. I've posted some video for you to watch. Of course, it's the substance of your discussion this week. But the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was presented now by the administration to Congress in order to justify a military escalation in Vietnam. And the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution itself had very specific language, very broad but specific language, to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States. That's what Johnson was asking for. Now, would this include the use of American troops? Well, certainly all necessary measures seemed to include that. Would it include the use of American military might, say, bombing from the air? Well, all necessary measures seem to accept that. In other words, where would this stop? Would it allow the president to unilaterally use, say, nuclear weapons? Well, it said all necessary measures, so no one was sure. But what we know is that the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution really took the place of a formal declaration of war. Congress did not declare war against Vietnam, but instead gave the president a kind of blank check to prosecute a war on other terms. His follow-up speech in February of 1965 was an attempt to now spell out to the American people why this congressional appropriation of some $700 million to fight the war, why the expected escalation of American troops, which would even include now a draft to fight a war in Vietnam, why it was somehow necessary. And as LBJ said in February of 65, why are we in South Vietnam? We are there because we have a promise to keep. Since 1954, every American president has offered to support the people of South Vietnam. We have helped to build and we have helped to defend. Thus, over many years, we have made a national pledge to help South Vietnam defend its independence. And I intend to keep that promise. To dishonor that pledge, to abandon this small and brave nation to its enemies and to the terror that must follow, would be an unforgivable wrong. We are also there to strengthen world order around the globe. Our people whose well-being rests in part on the belief that if they can count on us if they are attacked to leave Vietnam to its fate, would shake the confidence of all these people in the value of an American commitment and in the value of America's word. So here we see several times throughout the statement a promise to keep, a national pledge, to dishonor that pledge, the value of America's word. This was America once again putting its credibility on the line. And there is more than a little irony in that the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was in effect fabricated to leverage congressional and American support now for a war in Vietnam. If you break it down, the Gulf of Tonkin incident concerned two reputed firings on an American vessel, an American destroyer, the USS Maddox, which was in the Gulf of Tonkin, a large area off the coast of North Vietnam. The Americans, of course, claimed that the Maddox was in international waters when it was first fired upon by the Vietnamese communists. This claim has always been suspect. In fact, the best evidence seems to suggest that we were not in international waters, but in Vietnamese territorial waters. And if so, then the firing on the Maddox was justifiable by the North Vietnamese. The second attack, which was invoked by the administration to justify congressional support now for the war, did not happen whatsoever. It was a falsified report concocted by staffers within the National Security Agency to bolster the administration's case. So in effect, a false premise justifying the escalation of a war which the president said was necessary to protect our credibility. What happened next, of course, is a matter of history. From 1964 to 1965, our escalation of troops alone grows mightily. 184,000 troops by the end of 1965. Over 500,000, 525,000 troops by the end of 1967. So yes, deeper into the Vietnam War under the watch of the Johnson administration. Here you see graphically the huge increase in combat troops from January of 66 to the end of 1968, when we reach a peak of some 530,000 American troops in Vietnam. What some historians have come to call LBJ's War. From 1965 to 1968, we'll see the greatest U.S. military commitment of the decade in regard to Vietnam. And as we'll see in our credibility, Slaughterhouse-Five and the issue of credibility lecture, the deepening involvement in the Vietnam War will result not in any clear-cut victory, or even I guess we could say would be vindication of American credibility, but instead will only raise more questions about America's involvement, the truthfulness of the political leaders, and the deepening divisions in American society itself. So we'll continue on with this in the next video lecture, dealing with Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five.